morning. This is the first lesson on attachment. So this is the last and final part of the year 1 course that you're going to be doing this academic year, and it's looking at attachment, which falls within the area of psychology called developmental psychology. So it's largely about the way that we develop from birth through to death. And we're looking here at a particular part of that, which is the way in which attachments form, who they form with, how they form, and why we need them. So first of all, I want you to think about who you have attachments with and why you have those attachments and what they're for. So what does that word attachment actually mean? Is it some kind of bond? So there's a clip here. If you want to click on that, I've uploaded this PowerPoint as lesson 1. So the objectives for today's lesson are to explore caregiver interactions and to just have a look at what is meant by attachment and some of the different key terminology that's used in this section. So I'll start just by showing you the specification. So if we start at the top, if you notice, it doesn't actually say definitions of attachment, but we are going to look at that first just so that you understand that. And with each lesson I will come back to the spec at the start like this just to show you what we're going to be looking at here. So if you can see in orange at the top, in this session we're going to be looking at caregiver infant interactions in humans and 2 particular key terms, reciprocity and interactional synchrony. And because they're both named on the spec, that means that you can be asked direct questions about them. So you could be asked to discuss research into caregiver infant interactions. And the reason that it says in humans is because in this unit we're going to look at animal studies in particular. So you could be asked to define reciprocity, to give an example of reciprocity, the same with interactional synchrony, and you also need to be able to pick them out of applied questions, so where we might see this. I've also highlighted the role of the father because although it's on the second bullet point here, it is something that I'm going to try to bring in, and this hasn't been tested very much by AQA, so it is important that we look at that. So starting off with what is an attachment, it can be defined, you can look in any dictionary just to find out what the definition is, and usually you'll find the words emotional and bond, but it's some kind of emotional connection or bond between a child and the principal caregiver. Now, in the past, psychologists would have said the mother, but obviously that could be the person who provides the main care. And that is quite interesting because some people don't have a principal caregiver. They might have several, if, for example, they're brought up in a kibbutz or an orphanage or so on. But this is characterised by mutual affection, which is a bit of reciprocity, frequent interaction, a desire for proximity. So I'm going to be using the word proximity a lot, and that means the distance to which you are to somebody, so how close you are, and selectivity. So selectivity is who the child prefers to be with, who they want to be with. So the caregiver is usually the mother, but this could be the father and it could be some other person. Try to think about why it might be the mother. And obviously you're probably going to think about biologically because it's the mother who gives birth to the child, and that would be quite reasonable. But please just remember that it's not always that. So try to be careful to not say mother, just say caregiver. So, excuse me, another shorter definition here, it's a strong, enduring, emotional and reciprocal bond, I'll talk about that word in a minute, between 2 people, especially an infant and caregiver. So, this is some extra extended reading that you might want to do. This is not something that's on the spec, but it's something that I'm quite interested in terms of evolution, so I thought you might want to have a look at. And it's called the baby face hypothesis. And it's the idea that people in general want to care for young because they are cute. So this is a hypothesis that suggests the more baby face someone is, the more attractive we are likely to find them. And there are some of the features there in the bullet points that are seen as being attractive. Now, if we talk about in evolutionary terms, these are features, if you think about, that a female would want to have to attract attention. Not necessarily a large head, but large round eyes, small short nose, small chin. So if you want to click on this and have a little look, this is just a bit of extension. This is not something that you actually need. Okay, so if we go on to this, from an early age, babies do have meaningful social interactions with their carers. It's believed that these interactions have important functions for their development. Now we're going to look at what is meant by reciprocity. There are 2 clips here that you can read. But if you look at this, reciprocity, it's basically you give someone something and they give back. So for example, you smile at someone and they reciprocate by smiling back. You say thank you to somebody and they reciprocate by saying you're welcome. So that is just so you understand what reciprocity is. But we see this in babies very early. And it's important because that, you could argue, shows the start of an attachment. So if you've got reciprocity, you're seeing children reciprocate what their mum does. So if their mum smiles and the mum smiles back, and the baby smiles back, we can start to see reciprocity. And we could say that that's the first start of an attachment bond. The next bit of terminology that you need is called interactional synchrony. And again, if you watch this clip, I'm not going to show it on here, you can watch it yourselves. This should try to explain what it is, but interactional synchrony, people get confused between this and reciprocity, but interactional synchrony is a reflection where the mother and infant both do the same things in a coordinated way. And the best way to kind of think about that is, and I've always used this sort of analogy, it's mirroring. So reciprocity is where the mum smiles and the infant smiles back to reciprocate. But interactional synchrony is where the mother and child, or the caregiver and child, look at each other and both smile at the same time. So there is synchrony between them. So it is mirroring of each other's actions. It might be both holding their arms out to each other. So have a look in your attachment booklets and in your Green Herb book to just get a definition of that. Okay, so where is the evidence to support this? And this is the research that I would like you to focus on. And although it's not named on the spec, so you won't be asked about this directly, this would be the piece of research that you would use if you were talking about caregiver infant interactions. And this is by Meltzoff and Moore. And this is actually a little screenshot from the original study. And what you can see at the top is somebody doing 3 quite distinctive facial expressions, and what we can see at the bottom is the baby mirroring those facial expressions. So if you see here, it says at the bottom, sample photographs from videotape recordings of 2 to 3 week old infants imitating. The first one is a tongue protrusion, the second one is the mouth opening, and the third one is a lip protrusion. Now, have a look at this study, and this should show that there is some mirroring between this. So here's the study. Although it says 1994, the original study was done much earlier, but it's always being revised. So basically, infants were exposed, so they saw adults making certain facial expressions. And it was found that a 6-month-old could actually imitate those facial expressions a day later. So half of the infants saw an adult make a facial expression, for example, a tongue protrusion, and half of the infants saw an adult with a very neutral expectation. All the infants then saw the adult the next day. If the adult did that same facial expression, the infants were significantly more likely to repeat that expression. So this shows interactional synchrony. So you do need a piece of research to show that there is an interaction between caregiver and baby. So the research to support, as you can see, is a form of observation, because if you're going to be looking at infants and copying, the only way you can do it really is through an observational method. So I want you to think about why it's hard to know what's happening when you're observing infants. So what research methods are used in this area? The 2 main research methods that we're going to see over the next few sessions is naturalistic observation and controlled observation. We are going to bring in some other research methods, but why would we do that? Why would we use that method? Because it's the best way of gaining information, because infants can't talk to us. We don't know what they're thinking. So we've got to be able to observe them, but that's a problem because we're drawing conclusions. So think back to your approaches unit. We're drawing inferences, if you like, about what's happening. So we look at an infant and we assume that the infant is copying. It would probably be a reasonable conclusion, but why is it hard to know what's happening? Because we don't know. Infants smile at lots of different things. So for example, yes, they smile when they feel comfort, but they often also smile when they have wind or have some kind of discomfort. So it's often very difficult for us to pinpoint what the exact behaviour is that we are observing. Have a read up about different observations. I know that you've done this. We will recap it again in year 2. But please make sure that you're okay with what an observation is and what some of the issues are with that. So, like I said, 2 main research methods used in this area: controlled observations. So this is where the psychologist controls the setting and environment. So you can use an observation within an experiment, remember, it's a method that can be used within something. And a naturalistic observation, and that's where people or animals are observed in the natural environment without any interference from the researcher. And we're going to look to an extent at some of those as well. Okay, so what you should be able to do at the end of this session, you need to go and have a look at your booklets, and I'll talk you through the booklet in a second. You need to be able to answer the exam questions on infant-caregiver interactions. So number 1, explain what is meant by interactional synchrony, 2 marks. Say what it is, give an example. Outline research into caregiver interactions. That will be melts off and more. Just say what they did and what they found. If there's anything in this session that you're not sure of, please get back to me and I will try to help you. Have a look at all the PowerPoints and materials that I've uploaded onto Teams.